Hi everyone, it's me again, and this time it's a little demo on how I use deliberate distortion when I do my funky little buildings and scenes that I use photographs as reference for. So here we go. I can't actually tell you how I distort the buildings, it's an intuitive thing, but if you understand perspective, you're reversing the perspective, the actual thing you see. For instance, look at this old sketch I did, and you'll see how the buildings look like they're tipping over and tilting. That's what I'm talking about. Some of the top of the buildings get wider as they go up to the heavens above. Well, that's not the fact in real life. In real life, if you were looking up to the roof of a building, it would recede as it went into the distance. These watercolor ink markers are made by Tombow, and I use these, the grayscale ones, just for value. The next thing I'm going to show you are my fine line markers, and there's plenty on the market now, but these are made by Boxon. And then I'll sometimes use a white gel pen for embellishments as well. I use a number 2 and a number 3 mostly when I'm doing my first parts of the drawing. And I go over my pencil lines with these markers and I vary the line. And I'll move right up to a 0.8 marker as well for darker lines. And after this is done, I start adding my value. And the values are done with the watercolor ink markers. And I just use varying degrees of greys, starting with my light grey first. Now I may add more of the greys later on, but at least I have most of the main values in place before I start my watercolor washes. Now basically all I do now is start bit by bit putting in the foliage first that I see in between some of these buildings. It just breaks up some of the cityscape that I can see. So various mixtures of my greens, a little bit of the quinacridone gold, just using my little round number 8 brush by Silver Black Velvet, and I just make a few stabs at doing some foliage here and there. That basically gets things started for me, and it pushes the little houses forward. So from now on in, you're just going to see me doing these little touches here and there and piecing it together. So gradually I work through the composition in much the same way, adding a little bit of colour to the sunlit side of the buildings and reinforcing some of my little trees occasionally. So as the watercolour is faded, I give it a little bit more of a darker colour here and there. Now I'm working on the shadow side of the buildings as well. So by now, I know you're wondering what colours I'm using. Colour is so intuitive. With me in particular, I really don't think too much about my colours. I just grab, and I know that a lot of you really want to know the colours I use, and that's fine. I can tell you the colours I use, but you will use them differently to what I use them, so be aware of that. The shadow side of my buildings, I've used permanent rose and cobalt blue. For the sunlit side of the buildings, I've used a warm Naples yellow made by Lucas. For the water, I'm using a Lucas colour again, and it's just called turquoise. For my trees, I started with sap green and a little bit of quinacridone gold, and sometimes a little bit of lemon yellow. And to darken my trees later on, I add a little bit of French ultramarine blue to that mix. And here I'm adding some more of the turquoise into some of the roofs in the background. Always aware of keeping colour continuity in all my work, so the turquoise is quite a key colour and I like to just pop it into other areas. Now the colour here that I'm using is a little bit of burnt sienna with quinacridone and coral, and it's kind of a nice mixture, and I'm adding a tiny little bit of the sap green into that as well. And I blot with my paper towel just to remove some of the value. Now I apologise for this, I had to turn my editing sideways so that you'd be able to see what I was doing on the left hand side. I didn't realise because I had my painting in a vertical format that the camera wasn't picking it up. So just for a short part of this I'm going to be showing you a little bit crookedly, so you'll have to tilt your head to try and work out where I am. But I'm doing the boat and I'm putting the turquoise colour into the boat, which is the main foreground boat that I'm working on right now. Goodness, I'm glad that part's over. Now we're back to the right way up, so I hope you haven't got a little crick in your neck from watching that last stretch of video. But anyway, I'm on to the next boat, and part of the whole process of this sort of painting, it's just really a sketch, but it's also to do with design, and I'm very conscious of leaving whites in strategic areas. So this particular boat that I'm painting now, I'm going to leave a lot of it white. It's not going to be all covered in. Just placing colour just in a couple of areas for a little bit of interest, but a lot of it can just be left understated. So that's my boardwalk in. I've got the board's all painted in and some shadows started where the pylons are. And now I'm about to do some flicking of some paint into the sand area of the foreground. And being careful because you don't want it to splatter all over the blue, but this is a mixture of Scarlet Lake with a bit of quinacridone coral. And they're a lovely colour mixed together, these two colours, really nice. And I just tap my brush, the end of my brush with my finger to make some of the paint flick off the bottom of the brush. Leave a lot of white, I don't take out all the whites, and there will be some cooler colours coming into the shadow area of the boat as well. Now even in the shadowed areas, the cast shadows, I like to still put a warm down first and I will cool it down a little later. That's what you're seeing me do here. Even in this area, I start with the shadow being a warm mix of colours, and over the top of that later on I will put my cooler mix, which will be permanent rose and cobalt blue. But for now I'm just making it a little bit of the quinacridone coral and permanent rose. Now I'm adding a little bit of permanent rose with cobalt blue, and that's being worked into the already wet area from what I did with the warm colour, but just having a little bit of the warm colour playing against that cool is nice. Very carefully I start to add some darks to the dark side of the boat, and this is a mixture of cobalt blue with the permanent rose and a little bit of turquoise occasionally into that mix, and I want to leave a lot of the first layer of turquoise still showing. But this is just to cast a little bit of shadow into some of the areas on the boat. So basically now I'm just pulling my painting together with the shadow on the shadow side of things like these pylons, and I'll put a little bit on and I'll take a little bit off with my paper towel if I get a little too heavy-handed. Now my rocks, and I'm starting with French ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and a little bit of quinacridone gold for the light side of the rocks. So that's my distant rocks done. Now I'm starting on just a couple of these little boats, get a little bit of information on those. And I'm nearly ready to do my ink touches. And I could end up doing even more watercolor after I do my ink touches. It doesn't have to be the only, like the end of your painting that you do the ink. It can be midway and it can be right at the end. It depends on how you feel. Just reinforcing my shadows on the pylons and going back into the greenery in the distance, adding a little bit of dark here and there just to give a little bit more volume to that area. So after I've finished those little touches with my watercolor, I think I'm done with it for a little bit now, and I'll start working with my Tombow markers again, and then start doing some more delineation and lots more detail. So here we go. Here's the Tombow markers. As I said, I'll start working with my greys, and I'll build them up just a little bit more in the background, reinforce some of the windows, and I'll even start using black. So here we go, and just watch the way things start popping as soon as you put the darks in. Now I'm using my very darkest value in this particular pack, which is black, and I'm strategically popping that into certain areas, but as soon as you put that dark in, you'll see how the sketch starts to take a little bit more life on. All these little touches just give a little bit more interest to certain areas. Now obviously areas that are right in the foreground will need to be stronger and more delineated, so I don't want to make everything in the background too exciting or no one want to look at the foreground. So these little touches that I'm putting in now are just to augment what I'm going to do in the foreground. I've decided to put a couple of masts coming up from a couple of these little background boats, and I'm using the fine end of the Tombow marker to do this. So now all the embellishments and the little final touches, the icing on the cake, so to speak, are added to my little sketch, and I'm almost done. All in all, I've spent quite a long time on this sketch, but it is fun, and I hope you enjoyed it, and get out your pens and have a go. Thanks for watching.